Shifting over to Russia now, in the middle of World War One, Russia becomes involved in this huge revolution. And the revolution in 1917 would see the Bolsheviks, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, come to power. And one of the first things they did was negotiate a treaty to withdraw out of World War One early. And in order to do so, they had to give up quite a bit of territory to Germany in the West. However, it gave them the freedom to kind of focus on their own internal affairs instead. And one of those internal affairs was a civil war. Following the revolution, we have 3 years of civil war between the Bolsheviks, who had just kind of seized power, but they were challenged by others. You had the whites, the anti-communists who wanted to restore order. You had a growing nationalist party as well. And so the Bolsheviks create their Red Army and use it to defeat the whites in 1920. They execute the Tsar and his entire family. They didn't want the whites to use those to try to restore power to the Tsar, and ultimately went out. But millions of people died during this 3-year civil war following the Russian Revolution. Once consolidating power, Lenin's going to implement his new economic policy. This new economic policy gave state control of the economy. However, it allowed some small businesses and landowners quite a bit of freedom. And so your small scale industries could continue to be privately owned. It also allowed peasants to sell their surplus on a free market. However, the government did control most of your big industries and oversaw the overall economic planning of Russia as well. He's also going to implement programs to spread electricity across Russia, technical schools spread, regular education improves as well, and we're going to see literacy rates skyrocket as a result. However, within a few short years, Lenin's going to die. In 1924, Lenin suffers a stroke and unexpectedly dies, and this kind of leads to a power struggle for control of Russia. So the winner of this power struggle was Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin was a Russian nationalist. He eliminates all his rivals by 1928 to become the new dictator of the Soviet Union. And while Lenin had really focused on trying to spread communism around the globe, Stalin favored socialism in one country. He felt that Russia really needed to strengthen communism in their own nation before worrying about spreading it to other parts of the globe. And so that's what he did. And it started with his 5-year plans. His 5-year plans are going to replace Lenin's new economic policy. And these 5-year plans set quotas that businesses had to meet and emphasize your heavy industries, so especially your iron and steel industries, at the expense of consumer goods. And that becomes kind of a characteristic of communism in Russia for the next several decades, is you see a strong emphasis on your heavy industries, but they don't have a lot of your consumer goods available. However, this process of industrializing and focusing on heavy industries was extremely successful. Soviet output grew by 14 times, and they're going to become the third largest industrial power in the world going into World War II, only behind Germany and the United States. Some of his other programs, though, weren't as successful. One of those was the collectivization of agriculture. And so this idea of collectivization is that the state takes control of most of your farmland. They seize all these private farms and instead create these large collective farms. And the idea was that these collective farms would be more productive and they could use the surplus created on these collective farms to feed your industrial workers. A lot of the peasants resisted collectivization, but they were basically assigned to work on these large communal farms. The biggest problem with collectivization was that government quotas were placed way too high, and so peasants had no hopes of ever meeting those quotas. And so many peasants slaughtered their own livestock or burned their own crops and moved to the cities to work instead because they couldn't make a living through collectivization. And ultimately, collectivization was a huge failure. As many as 3 million peasants were either killed or starved to death as a result. Another one of his programs was the Great Purge. The Great Purge was an effort to root out anybody against Stalin's policy of collectivization and anyone against his regime in general. But it especially focused on high-ranking army officers. About half of the Army's high-ranking officers were either put in labor camps or executed. It also attacked the Central Committee members as well. And anyone against his regime was either put to death or placed in these labor camps. And upwards of 8 million people were forced into labor camps as a result of the Great Purge, and upwards of 3 million or so were killed during this cleansing.